today for NMMA's post-election advocacy briefing. For those that I don't know, my name is Nicole Vassilaris. I am the Senior Vice President for the National Marine Manufacturers Association. Next slide, please. I'm incredibly honored today to be joined by two industry veterans here in Washington, D.C. as we give a little bit of insight into what the next weeks, months, and even years have ahead of us. Tucker Warren, who is a partner at Hamilton Place Strategies, will be joining us for today's webinar, as well as longtime friend and partner, George Cooper with Forbes Tate Partners. Next slide. So here's kind of a bit of an overview of what we're going to tackle today. We're going to get into the election results and some takeaways, particularly for the recreational boating industry. We'll talk about the 2020 successes, as well as our priorities and the lame duck, what remains for the end of this year. And then we're really going to get into a panel discussion between myself, Tucker, and George to talk really about the implications of this election, some of the opportunities for the boating industry, and what we can expect. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to start populating those. Hopefully we'll get to as many of them as possible. This is being recorded, so if you've got colleagues that want to listen in at a later time, we will be able to have this session recorded for you, as well as make sure that we share the slides that will be presented today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So I know this map is probably burned into all of our brains at this point, but it's officially all filled in. And we can talk a little bit about some of the electoral picture that we saw from 2020. Here you'll see that Joe Biden was successful in obtaining 306 electoral votes, with Donald Trump getting 232. A little bit unique, this was the exact breakdown that we saw in 2016, obviously the other way for President Trump, but in 2016 it was another 306-232 division. A couple key states that really put it over the finish line for Joe Biden and the Democrats in the White House. In the Sun Belt, all eyes were on Arizona and Georgia. Those states haven't turned blue for almost 30 years. President Clinton was the last one to win those states for the Democratic Party. And then we saw a flip in the Rust Belt of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These were all red states back in 2016 that went back for the Democratic Party and for Joe Biden in 2020. 306 gives now President-elect Biden enough electoral votes to get over that 270 vote threshold. Next slide, please. So what's the big picture? I know that this wasn't a typical election year in so many ways, with the race not being officially called to November 7th, when Pennsylvania and Nevada were projected to give the vice president the 270 votes needed. We saw even just this weekend, other states come in with more of a firm tally. Now, a lot of this, of course, has to do with many of the races were tight, but an unprecedented year with mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. Different states handled them differently in terms of when they could start counting them. Not everyone had the ability to count them on election day. And so it gave a little bit of a longer election week, if you will, before we found the final results. President Trump has yet to officially concede the election, and there are some ongoing lawsuits happening in states, but none of them have really gained the traction that we think will overturn the 306 electoral votes that President-elect Biden currently has. It is a monumental year. Biden will actually be our oldest serving president in U.S. history. And for the first time ever, our Vice President, Kamala Harris, will be the first female and first Black and Indian American woman to serve as Vice President of the United States. The Biden team is in full-on transition mode. Just like other previous presidents-elect, they are really prioritizing right now filling those senior roles. They have set up landing teams, as they call them, in each of the agencies, such as Department of Interior, Department of Commerce, the EPA, to really put out the organization and the operations of each of those agencies. And then they'll start to look at positions, filling those personnel positions, as well as the policy trajectory of those agencies agencies for the weeks and months ahead. We expect by mid-December, you're going to see a lot of those announcements of the senior roles, particularly nominations for cabinet level secretaries will be announced, obviously not being confirmed until after the president has been sworn in, but we'll start to get a much more holistic view of really the leadership of the Biden team in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. Turning over to the Senate, we still don't have an extremely clear picture, though there are definitely some anticipation of what's going to happen. The two races in Georgia are set to go to a runoff on January 5th. So all eyes are definitely on Georgia. If you live in Georgia, I'm sure you can't get away from it, and you'll definitely be hearing all those ads continuing for the next few weeks to come. Because the importance of Georgia is really that's going to determine who's in control of the House of the Senate. Right now, Republicans have 50 seats. And Democrats have 48 seats. So those two remaining seats are going to determine the party that's in power. A couple other things to take note by these Senate numbers. We saw several senators who didn't seek re-election in 2020, and a couple of our key incumbents were defeated, notably Cory Gardner of Colorado. He was one of the main architects of the Great American Outdoors Act, lost his re-election bid, as well as Doug Jones, who was really instrumental in the passage of the Modern Fish Act back in 2018. He unfortunately lost his re-election bid as well. A pretty unique Senate class. You've got an astronaut, a football coach, a former governor, and a couple former members of Congress. So it'll definitely be an interesting mix for the 117th Congress. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have to wait till January 5th to have that clear crystal ball on who's going to be in control of the Senate. If Republicans maintain at least one of those seats, they will maintain control of the Senate. Democrats would have to flip both of those seats in order to take over and to have the vice president be that tie-breaking vote in favor. And this is so important because it's really going to determine the overall trajectory of how far and how sweeping changes the Biden administration will be able to implement on the legislative side. Obviously, if they're able to control both the House and Senate and the White House, there's a lot more opportunity to maneuver. But if Republicans maintain control of the Senate, which I will say is expected, it'll serve as a backstop to a lot of those more sweeping policy changes that may have otherwise been implemented. So we'll stay tuned for January 5th and see what happens in the Senate. Again, most likely Republicans to maintain control of that chamber. Next slide, please. So here is the House of Representatives by the numbers. In 2020, we expect the Democrats so far have 219 seats compared to Republicans 203 seats. There's about a dozen races that are either going to a runoff or have yet to be called. But Democrats will maintain control over the House of Representatives. On the slide, you can see there was a significant influx of members that did not seek re-election in 2020. Most of them were Republicans. The overwhelming majority of them were Republicans. So it paved the way for a lot of open seat races. And many of those open seats really went in Republican favor. There was a lot of expectation that Democrats would be able to gain greater margins in the House to have a larger share of the control. But in fact, rather than gaining more control, they actually ended up losing several incumbent seats. A couple to note here, some key voting champions that lost their re-election bid were Donna Shalala of Florida's 27th district, representing the Miami area, as well as Joe Cunningham from South Carolina's 1st district, another key champion of the Great American Outdoors Act, and sad to see both of those members lose their re-election bid. So at the end, there's still, like I said, a handful of races that are still left to be called. But Democrats will maintain control of the House of Representatives. Next slide, please. So what are those implications? Well, one, obviously, as I stated, they failed to expand their majority. There was a lot of missed pickup opportunities from the Democratic Party. Some vulnerable Republicans were able to maintain their seats, which was good news for them. It is expected there's leadership races this week that Nancy Pelosi will be reelected to serve as Speaker. But there's some new renewed questions. You have a lot of the more progressive wing of the party that has been pretty vocal, how to keep both the progressives and the moderates together when you have that slim of margins and really being able to carry out the agenda of the president. You're going to have a lot of cohesion among the Democratic Party. And while I know nobody wants to talk about the 2022 race right now, a lot of eyes, especially in the House of Representatives, are going to be on that. Traditionally, the White House that is in power tends to lose seats in the midterms. And because there's such a narrow margin of control right now for Democrats, they're going to be doing everything they can to maintain that control and that party power for the 2022 races. Another point that I'll make here, and I think sometimes this got lost in a lot of the rhetoric, is when Democrats took control in 2018 in a pretty significant blue wave election, a lot of folks saw the Democrats in the House as really being the more progressive part of the party, the more progressive wing, if you will, and the squad is what many folks might have had the perception of. But the truth is, and the reality is, that 2018 class was incredibly moderate, incredibly pro-business, and seeking to work across the aisle. And those were the ones that were on the front line this past election. Those were the 8 seats that have already been lost, that were really unable to go back home and talk about a lot of the things that they maybe had hoped to, like another stimulus bill, who had been painted with a lot of the rhetoric that had been out there of socialism and defund the police. And so those, the failure of the Democrats in the House to really gain more control and more majority, and those missed opportunities, as well as the losses that they have, a lot of that can be contributed to just a misperception of really that 2018 class and how vulnerable some of those moderate pro-business members were. Next slide, please. So here's just a few of the key race outcomes. I've mentioned many of them. I'm really pleased that some of our key voting champions, the co-chairs of the Congressional Voting Caucus for the 116th, Lois Frankel, Gary Peters, Jackie Walorski, all will return to the 117th Congress, and really pleased to see that outcome. Next slide, please. So as many of you are aware, BoatPak is the political action committee of the National Marine Manufacturers Association and the Marine Retailers Association of the Americas. In this race, we were able to support 72 candidates for federal office, and 63 of those were successful in their election bids. So a pretty good return on investment. As we all know, we're waiting a couple of decisions. And as I've mentioned, there were a few defeats, particularly in South Carolina and Florida, that were former BoatPak champions and supporters. Next slide, please. Another key metric to watch is the Congressional Boating Caucus. This has been a really important factor in the recreational boating industry's ability to build a bench of champions on Capitol Hill. Folks that understand who our industry is, the economic impact, and really help to be our voice and champion those issues that are most important to the recreational industry. We expect about 108 members of the Congressional Boating Caucus to be returning for the 117th Congress, with a few races remaining to be called. And here you can see the breakdown: 23 senators, 86 House members, about 49 Democrats, and 60 Republicans. All in all, we lost about 20 members of the Congressional Voting Caucus. The vast majority of these members had already announced their retirement prior to the 2020 race, but also we did see some of the incumbent losses that I've mentioned that took down some of the ranks of the voting caucus. That we expect at least 65, if not a few more freshman members, if you will, to be inducted into the 117th Congress. And so we really have a job to do to make sure that we're reintroducing ourselves to members of Congress that have been there for a few years, and introducing ourselves, of course, for the first time to all of those freshmen. We want to build back the ranks of the Congressional Voting Caucus to make sure that it is bipartisan, bicameral, And this is something that I know as a united industry, we're going to be focused on after the first of the year. Next slide, please. So here are a list of some of the key committees that we work with. And the reason why committees are so important is that's where just a lot of the work gets done. That's where the big bills like a highway bill and a water bill and a recreational bill all get hammered out in these key committees. And the reason I bring this up is obviously we don't know which party is going to be in control in the Senate. If Republicans are able to maintain control, there won't be as much as a shift. But obviously, if Democrats take over, all the chairmanships will be shifted over. But we do have some members that have been term limited from their chairmanships, most notably the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which has been chaired by Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. She has been term limited. And so that leaves a bit of an opening between that committee as well as the Environment and Public Works Committee, where Senator Barrasso is currently the chair. So we'll be keeping a close eye on those two committees and the leadership that will go into effect there. As well in the House of Representatives, there is a race for the ranking member, the number 2 spot on the House Natural Resources Committee. This is the committee that deals with public national park issues, a lot of our fisheries and conservation issues. And Congressman Bruce Westerman of Arkansas is running to be the ranking member of that committee. He's been a great champion for our industry. He represents a couple boat manufacturers in his district in Arkansas. And so we'll be keeping a close eye on that leadership race as well. Next slide, please. So while 2020 has been an incredibly hard and painful year for so many of us, both personally and professionally, there has been a lot of success on the advocacy front. And I think if you were to have one key takeaway from 2020 is it's shown a really bright spotlight on advocacy and the impact that government decisions at every level, federal, state, even down to your local municipal governments can have on the ability of manufacturers to operate, of retail outlets to stay open or be closed, and some of the safeguards that need to be undertaken there, all the way down to the consumer. We saw this year, particularly in the spring and the height of the beginning of this pandemic, access restrictions. And so our team has really been laser focused on making sure that we can provide a rapid response effort. And we've seen some great successes with reopening manufacturing in all 50 states, reopening boating access in all 50 states, providing resources for manufacturers and dealers and consumers to operate in this new pandemic and new environment. We've been at the table for trillions of dollars of stimulus packages that have been put forward and signed into law, helped everybody maneuver the popular Paycheck Protection Program, which we estimated provided over $100 million of direct funding to this boating industry. At the same time, we prevented harmful luxury tax legislation from being implemented in Canada. We helped secure $850 million in funding for critical habitats in the Great Lakes and Everglades. And we passed historic legislation at a time when a highway bill and a water bill hasn't been passed. A recreation infrastructure bill was passed this summer, which invests $9.5 billion in outdoor recreation infrastructure. And so really pleased with some of the success we've been able to see so far, and it's not over yet. Next slide, please. So we're now in the term of what everybody calls the lame duck. The election is over. There's still about another month and a half of this Congress. And so there's a lot of things that still need to get over the finish line before the new Congress comes back in January, where everything is really just a clean slate. If the bill doesn't pass by the end of this year, you've got to start all over again. And we have some priorities. In particular, we want to see a water resources development bill passed that really focuses and for the first time in a while on recreation infrastructure needs. And we're hopeful that a U.S. Coast Guard bill will be passed that has some important safety provisions related to mandatory cutoff, as well as the ability to provide some more flexibility for the Coast Guard in updating their standards to ABYC. So those are some of the lame duck opportunities that we are paying close attention to in the coming weeks. Next slide, please. So that's kind of my spiel. I want to bring in our all-stars, Tucker and George, if we can put up their videos. We're going to kind of transition now into a little bit of a discussion about what all these numbers actually mean in real policy making.
Hi, good to be with you.
Nice to be
everyone.
with you. Everybody can see us. We've got George, Tucker, myself. All good? All right. Well, welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for being here. I got a couple of hard-hitting questions, and let's get started. George, why don't I start with you? I was just talking about the lame duck. Do you think that we're going to get some meaningful legislation? What's kind of your prediction for the lame duck priorities?
Yeah, I think as we sit here on Monday, the Senate was actually back last week. We were able to discern a few signals there. The House back this week, but in both instances, a lot of the attention is on each party doing their leadership elections, et cetera. A lot of people are keeping an eye on Mitch McConnell in particular. If we just start with looking at the potential for COVID relief legislation, which just never broke loose before the election, those negotiations were going on between Nancy Pelosi and the White House, and Mnuchin was the primary representative of the administration on those. You're now seeing a situation where McConnell is, at least theoretically, signaling he'll step into direct negotiations. He'd been on the sideline waiting to see what the White House might negotiate, and the White House stepping back. Since he has signaled his interest in doing that, there's been no close whatsoever of the gap between what Mitch McConnell says we should be contemplating and Senate Republicans and what Democrats in general should say we should be contemplating. Nancy Pelosi wants to stay way up at a figure that's somewhere around $2 trillion, which is actually in the neighborhood of where they were with the White House before negotiations broke off before the election. And McConnell's talking about something that's more like $500 to $600 billion. So there's more agreement than we had 3 months ago, let's say, on the sort of categories of what money would go to. But the delta between the total price tag has not moved much recently. So the factors that could shake something like that loose, we're continuing to see really startling and incredible numbers in terms of case rates going up and hospitalizations. Do things get dire enough just in the day-to-day front pages of people's newspapers and on the local news that drives Republicans to want to come more in the direction of Democrats? Do the Democrats see enough urgency that they're willing to come down in their price tag? And then the really interesting factor here is whether do the Biden people make the calculation they'd like to see a deal get hammered out now and not have it hanging over them as they start the new administration? And then the other dynamic that I defy anyone to predict is whether the outgoing president, President Trump, is going to play ball and be willing to sign anything. So that's really an open question, whether we get a COVID relief package done. As far as some of the other things you tick through, if there's one thing, and really the only thing that Congress still gets done on a regular annual basis, it's National Defense Authorization Act. So it's funding our defense, and that actually gets done. So expectations are that gets done before these guys check out. Some talk of maybe attaching a few things here and there, a few of which actually have to do with public lands and conservation. But there's NDAA. The other thing hanging out there, and this goes back to more of the dynamics around doing a COVID relief package, is we have the ticking clock that is always ticking in the fall here in Washington, which is running out of money. So when we reached the end of the fiscal year back in September, we went with our typical continuing resolution, and the one that was agreed to got us to December 11th. So December 11th, they either do another CR that takes us into the new year, or they knock out a sort of a big grand deal that we call omnis around here, an omnibus spending package. Again, the dynamics, you have most of the interests aligned around just getting it done and funding us through the next fiscal year. Again, you can imagine the Biden people not wanting to have that on their to-do list right when they walk in the door. It does look like McConnell and Senate Republicans want to knock something out. I think Pelosi and the House Dems do, but is this president going to want to cooperate? Is he going to be more inclined to hold some final spending priorities hostage and be willing to allow us to have a government shutdown? It's hard to say right now. But those are some of the biggies. And then you tick through some more specific things of highest interest to our industry. And I would just say, the other thing I'd flag is I think we have some guarded optimism. We could get the Water Resource Development Act reauthorized, and NMMA has done an excellent job of positioning some industry priorities in there. So we're guardedly optimistic there.
Okay, it's going to be a busy couple of weeks, that's for sure. Tucker, I want to ask you a question. Obviously, we're all adapting to this virtual world, but now we have a president-elect who's having to set up an entire administration virtually. What challenges do you think come about that? And how do you see business groups and other groups really adapting to that virtual setting?
Yeah, so the Biden administration and team have, I think, two challenges that are kind of tangled, right? One of them is a delayed transition period. We saw that in 2000 in Bush v. Gore with Florida recount. So it's not entirely unprecedented. And I think that a delayed certification and starting the transition period, which is important for all of these agencies to start sharing information, because regardless of your politics, you want someone on the job ready to do it on day one. And so the delay in transition is a challenge, though I think it is less of a challenge for someone like Biden and the people in his circle around him who are no strangers to Washington. They've got relationships. Obviously, Biden has spent his entire career in Washington. So I don't think he'll have the challenges that a complete newcomer for Washington would have just in the delayed implementation. I think specific to the virtual setting, I think the same thing kind of applies a bit there. There are people in Washington that this transition team knows and has worked with and has worked on issues like trying to get TPP done under Obama and kind of a larger business community. So I think that piece of it maybe isn't quite as tricky. I think we've all transitioned into an environment where our business, which enjoyed a lot more face-to-face and kind of personal relationships, those things are now largely online for the foreseeable future. And so I think the transition there has happened. One thing that is worth noting, though, is I do think a Biden administration will be a more decentralized operation broadly than the Trump administration has been. So as you think about business outreach, where under a Trump administration, you really could do all of your kind of typical advocacy relationship things that would all be expected right on up to the person as close as possible to the president. And depending on what the president's view was, those things could just get rolled at the last minute. I think what you'll see in a Biden administration is that there will be just more of a decentralization of that process, and that deputies, people like Ron Klain, chief of staff, and others will be expected and empowered to make significant decisions, and that those decisions will hold right on up to the president.
Okay, makes sense.
And it actually might be good to hear from you, Nicole, on this one, because I'm sure that you all are reaching out to the Biden transition team. How have those conversations been, though virtual, I would imagine?
Yeah, it's really important for the industry to hedge our bets prior to November, right? We've built a really great relationship with the Trump administration. So we started pretty early on having those conversations with, at that time, the Biden campaign. Had a really great opportunity in October, actually, to sit down with the senator and to sit down with, at that point, Vice President Biden himself and talk about the outdoor recreation industry, the economic impact. So we've laid a lot of that groundwork. And, as I mentioned, the transition teams, the landing teams, if you will, they're already in place. We're trying not to overwhelm them, but those are going to be the conversations that we're having in the weeks to come. And, one of the benefits I think we've all learned from virtual nature, that people are a little bit more flexible with their schedule, which gives new opportunity. And we're coming into it, I think it couldn't even be better timing. We just had the Bureau of Economic Analysis release new numbers for the outdoor recreation economy at a time when so many sectors of the economy have been failing. Actually, ours has been growing, and the numbers tell it. So we've been really pleased with those discussions, and I think that we're poised to continue to have them and make sure that this industry is well positioned for a Biden team. So, George, I have a question for you. If the expectation is that we end up having a divided government, at least in Congress with the two chambers, what's kind of your outlook for bipartisanship? It's something that we've been really successful with in the past few years, and actually getting meaningful legislation. What's kind of your prediction of, will that bipartisanship be reinvigorated under a Biden presidency? How do you see it?
So lots of armchair psychology going on here in DC these days, and trying to figure out whether Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden are really good friends. Have they just known each other a long time? I mean, I think one thing's clear is you'll remember the kind of things Mitch McConnell was saying about the Obama presidency when it was first getting started, and his determination to make sure it was a failure and defeat Obama. And I'm not sure we could have gotten off to much of a worse start. And then Democrats, in that case, Obama started not with divided government, but control. And of course, that's how they were able to put ACA through. And then after that, you saw, almost nothing go on in terms of the two sides trying to work with each other. And, much has been written about Obama not having a lot of appetite or interest in that. And when they did have to get some things done, when there were things truly about to take us off some fiscal cliffs, the guy they sent to the Hill from the White House was Joe Biden. And he was in the Senate for 36 years and knew a lot of these people, and certainly knew how it worked and how to figure out how to find some compromises. So, clearly it's going to be very different this go around than the last Democratic White House, where, Obama was inviting Republicans to play golf or have a beer or whatever. Joe Biden's going to wear these guys out. It's going to be different. And he's going to set a tone with his Ledge Affairs shop and their operation, I think, where you're going to have at least some better communication. On the other side of that question, how much appetite is Mitch McConnell going to have for doing things that are big or bipartisan? I don't think a lot. We're not going to see a lot of legislation coming through. But could the ever elusive infrastructure package happen? Yeah, I could definitely see that. I'm loath to make any optimistic comments about that after we went through about 50 infrastructure weeks in the last 4 years.
We're going to get it. And nobody thought tax reform would happen, and it finally happened. We're going to get an infrastructure bill. So,
yeah, I mean, look, we don't do pork anymore, or the sort of goodie bags that we used to do, and an infrastructure package is the closest thing we still have to that. And so you can imagine them getting together to do that, because it could be responsive to the economic stimulus we really still need and are going to need for a while. The Biden administration, Congressional Democrats are dying to do some things on climate. They know now. I agree with Nicole, highly, highly unlikely that the Democrats grab those 2 Georgia seats. They have to grab both if they're going to have the Senate, that they're not going to be able to do a big climate bill. So they're going to want to look for places to do that. The only other thing I think the bottom line is not a lot of bipartisanship. House Democrats, that squabbling that you're seeing now is going to just go on and on. Nancy Pelosi's down to the narrowest margin any House speakers had, I think, since World War II. And it's going to affect the kind of bills she can bring to the floor and the kind of cushion she has. And the moderates and the progressives will keep fighting. I spend most of my time on doing Senate stuff, and I think we were very smart. If we think about the few things that did get through Congress in the past couple of years in particular, Great American Outdoors Act was one of them. There was another package NMMA supported called America's Conservation Enhancement Act that had a bunch of good stuff for hunting and fishing and the Chesapeake Bay and some other stuff. Very much like GAOA, in the end, it went through in overwhelming bipartisan fashion. Okay, so why did those things go through? There's lots of reasons they went through. But the main thing is outdoor recreation. What this industry has done, along with our peer outdoor rec industries, is really positioned ourselves well. So that takes me right to who's in cycle for 2022. We have to immediately look ahead in the Senate to who's up. And it's going to be very similar to this last go around, and the Republicans have about 22 seats to defend. Democrats have about half of that. And the Republicans are going to have a lot more of the vulnerable senators. So NMMA does a great job of making sure that we're really working with those senators in cycle to make sure they have good things to talk about when they're running back home. Steve Daines was up in Montana. He ended up being a big lead on GAOA. Same goes for Cory Gardner. It wasn't enough to pull him through in Colorado. He lost to John Hickenlooper. But if we look at who's up for Republicans, Marco Rubio's up in Florida. Senator Portman's up in Ohio. We have open races in North Carolina. All these states that we just saw, Senator Johnson's up in Wisconsin. If we're smart, we're going to be taking our priorities and thinking about how the leadership is going to be looking at those races. And we're going to still have some opportunities to get some things through and get some things done. The stuff we work on doesn't necessarily get caught up in some of these bigger fights about whether you ever do anything on taxes or other big things. So I think we'll be able to certainly get some singles, Nicole, on the stuff we care about. We've shown we can do it this past year. And I think if we're smart, we continue to use some of those dynamics. We're also going to have an administration with a very strong interest in doing good stuff on outdoor recreation and working with our industry.
Okay. So there's still room for bipartisanship, at least if it's just with our issues,
Especially,
right?
yeah, especially on our stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. Tucker, everybody focuses on the president's first 100 days in office. Do you have any predictions from a policy side, what you would expect to come out of those first 100 days?
Well, I think, looking at the Obama administration and the end of the Obama administration is a pretty good place to start. Like George said, I too don't expect that Georgia will end up with both of those seats going to the Democrats. So I think, the Biden administration is going to be reasonable as to what it puts on the table in that environment. So you're not going to see something huge like an ACA push because there's just not going to be the political will for that. But the first 100 days, I think, are important in setting the tone. You certainly see a flurry of executive orders, and that was something that started under Obama. It certainly continued under Trump, and I expect that Biden will undo a lot of the Trump executive orders right out of the gate. The COVID crisis that we are still in, with where the numbers are and appear to be heading as colder months are upon us and more people are inside. I think that's certainly going to be a challenge that is front and center of his plate every single day. And if we're in a place, which there's been good news over the last week on a vaccine, then you've got to start thinking about what does the deployment of that vaccine look like potentially as early as spring. So I think most of what you will see that will feel different is going to be more perhaps tone and stylistic and undoing of executive orders. But the other things, the singles that George touched on there, I think that's right. I mean, everything else is going to be kind of by regular legislative process. The good news is that, if that Joe Biden is a deal maker. He has prided himself his entire career on working across the aisle. And, while I think it's true that the country is as divided as it's ever been, certainly when it comes to political rhetoric, you do have someone going into the White House that at his core believes in getting things done and making deals, more so than just being able to say that he was right on something. That's not where his DNA is. It'll be interesting to see who he surrounds himself with, and if it's certainly true that there is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that is tugging him to the left, and making the case that with 306 electoral votes that the mandate is there to take a more progressive tack. I think that there will be spots where that is the case, and I think environment is probably going to be one of them. But I think by and large, I think he's going to look to put things in play that can get done. And I think Corona has got to be item one, and with environment on item two, and things like emission standards for autos. That was a very quick out of the gate thing for President Obama. The Trump administration has had a lawsuit with the state of California on auto emissions. I think that's something that this administration looks to get out of, cut some sort of deal, and probably get back to Obama era emissions and kind of setting the EPA up in that process differently than it has been over the last 4.
Absolutely. To our attendees, if any of this has sparked some questions, please make sure to use that Q&A box. We have a couple more discussion points between the three of us, but I want to make sure we get your input as well. So Tucker, you kind of set the stage. The environmental agenda was top of line for the Biden campaign, and there are definitely businesses and industries, including ours, that have some trepidation of what does that look like, how quickly will those benchmarks be implemented, and is the technology there? George, do you have any insight of kind of how that environmental agenda will mean for businesses, and obviously with the Senate being most likely in Republican hands, what that realistically means too?
So when people were still thinking about the potential for, let's just say, the House not only staying in Democratic hands, but predictions that Nancy Pelosi might actually pick up 10 or 15 seats, and people were Democrats were drooling at the prospect of having actual control of the Senate, Biden in the White House. There were big dreams about a major climate bill. We were talking about things like doing away with the filibuster, even thinking about things like packing the court. All those things are, of course, now to the side. So things pull back down to a much more realistic and practical level, but the themes stay the same. And for the Biden administration, that's climate, climate, climate. So they got to figure out now, and they've got people part of their team, and we should note, Nicole mentioned these so-called landing teams. That's kind of a first phase. There's going to be another set of teams coming in associated with each of the federal agencies that are more of the governing teams. And that's where we'll really start getting into some serious policy conversations. And they're going to be looking for ways to implement throughout every agency and every nook and cranny they can think of, ways to affect climate crisis or the climate issues we're confronting as a country, or not confronting in some cases. So this industry has to be very smart in thinking ahead, as I think we've done a good job of it to date. But you're going to have some people in a new Biden administration that might be surprised to hear the boating industry has things to say about climate and has a perspective on this. But that's going to be part of any conversations we're having. I go back to something like infrastructure. They're going to have to get creative and look for ways to, by they I mean Democrats, work climate into some bills. You're seeing a growing number of Republicans understand that they can't just say, "Oh, I think climate crisis is real," and and they might even say something about whether the role humans have in that. They're going to have a little bit more to talk about there. And so again, I'll just stick with the example of Marco Rubio running for re-election to the Senate in Florida. He's moved further and further out, talking about climate change as being a real problem. And of course, you can't, I think, represent the state of Florida and not have credibility there. So, if we think about whether it's an infrastructure bill, they're going to have to do a highway bill. They kind of kicked the can down the road on that, just extended it into next year. What we saw in that is John Barrasso, senator from Wyoming, major oil and gas state, climate-related things made it into the bill that didn't ultimately pass, but that we're going to still be dealing with. There are more Republicans wanting to do that. So, Nicole, the answer to your question is it's not going to be nearly as big and bold and ambitious as it might have been. Democrats will look for ways to work it into the relatively small number of pieces of legislation that will go. But one thing we'll see right away is if you saw the Trump administration undo an Obama thing on climate change at EPA or elsewhere, the Biden people are going to instantly reverse those. And then they'll move on to starting to do some of their own new things on the administrative front where they don't need Congress's approval. Beyond climate, it is really going to be almost everything. I can't emphasize that enough. Is going to be through the lens of what is this going to do in terms of giving Joe Biden the ability to say, 4 years from now, if indeed he runs for re-election, here's all the stuff we've done in climate.
So really, I would agree with one thing that George mentioned, just that every agency tasked with having a climate lens to how they're thinking about policy and oversight. Actually, just what in the last couple of weeks, the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the Fed itself put out language about climate risk as a factor that it wants market participants to look at and include in their quarterly reports and how they're talking about what they're investing in. So, I think part of this wheel is actually already started to turn, even prior to a Biden administration. The recognition of climate and environment as a risk factor, and the open question as to how do these agencies and policymakers wrestle with what constituents and investors are asking them to measure and develop indicators for. It's why you're seeing growth in in ESG and measurement, which is environment, it's social, and it's governance. And the E part there is something that the Treasury Department is starting to look at as well. So I think you'll see that as a cross departmental mandate rather than just something out of EPA or Department of Transportation or Energy.
Okay. So the big takeaway is that's the environmental lens is going to be what everything's being looked at, and we're going to have to keep a close eye and monitor it, but also be proactive. I think, as George, you mentioned, and Tucker, even companies are doing this. We have a good environmental story to tell. We've been leaders on conservation with the Sport Fish Restoration Boating Trust Fund and with so many other reductions in emissions and reinvestments in local communities. And we just have to tell that story. And so that's something we'll be focused on. Tucker, I want to ask you, one of the big issues for our industry has been trade. The past 4 years, there's been a lot of uncertainty around trade. We've been caught up in almost every tariff battle that's been out there. How do you think the Biden administration is going to approach trade and some of the tariffs in particular?
So, I mean, Biden is a globalist, and he's been a pro-trade guy through and through. So, I would expect that he will embrace global economics and trade relationships in a way that at times this administration has shied away from. You could even see approaching the TPP countries and figuring out a way for the U.S. to potentially become party to TPP. And of course, Canada and Mexico were a part of that original group, and now we've got the USMCA. But I think there will be a desire for the U.S. to demonstrate leadership through trade deals in ways that, again, at times the Trump administration shied away from. I think tariffs is tricky. I mean, I don't think philosophically Biden, he's not a pro-tariff guy, and I don't think he's going to surround himself with people that are. The challenging thing with tariffs is it's a little bit like the genie out of the bottle, because you initiate a tariff and then you've got a retaliatory tariff. And so how do you can't unilaterally disarm in that environment, because those products and components have already been repriced to account for the tariff that's been slapped on those things. So I think he's going to intellectually want to try to unwind as many of those things as possible. But I think you've got to do them slowly and carefully, because again, you don't want to put yourself at a tremendous disadvantage. But what I just described is precisely the reason why most economists view is that tariffs are not good policy, because you don't want a tariff in and then a tariff out swinging every 4 years. There historically have been kind of better ways to deal with some of this stuff. China, in some ways, is its own kettle of fish, and that's probably a Zoom call in and of itself. But the dynamics with China will be tricky. Biden has been very critical of China himself over the years, and so in some ways, you almost have to put some of the negotiations with China in its own bucket.
Nicole, I would just quickly add to that. Tucker used two adjectives that we would not associate with the current administration's trade policies: slowly and carefully, right? If there's one thing we know it's coming, is we're going to have more stability. Things are going to be a little more calm. Meetings we would have at USTR over the course of the past 4 years, you'd be sitting in USTR. Those of you who've been there know it's right across the street from White House, basically, and they would look at us and say, we wait to see what comes from over there and what gets tweeted. We will go back to a more traditional structure where more career people at USTR will be helping set decisions about things like tariffs. And some are going to stay in place, some are going to go away. The one thing I just really wanted to emphasize is, for anyone out there thinking about China and whether this administration will be tougher or less tough when it comes to China, particularly using trade tools in their overall posture with China, is these guys are going to stay very tough. They may do it differently. They may rely less on tariffs. But you're also going to have congressional Democrats who have been inclined to be even tougher on China than the Trump administration's been, not really in a collaborative situation with the Trump administration. They're going to want to double down on being tougher on China too. So I think everyone just needs to be bright-eyed and clear as to how Democrats are going to be approaching China relations and how trade's going to figure out into that in particular. But as far as NMMA's priorities and how maybe we fix some things up, that were going on in our trade relations with Europe, I'd feel more optimistic there that there'll be some cooling down. But
yeah, I would agree, George. I'm pretty optimistic between, especially the 25% retaliatory tariff that we're experiencing with Europe. I think that, I mean, you've heard, obviously, President-elect has spoken to many of the European leaders. I think that there's some opportunity to remove those metal tariffs that instigated the retaliatory effort. But I agree, he's not going to want to appear weak on China. I think it will be more for us process opportunities like the exclusions or extensions of review, or if you got your exclusion denied, maybe having a different opportunity to re-put your case up. I think there has just been a lot of questioning and concern about the process of those tariffs, but I don't see them necessarily, going off on day one. I want to get to a couple of the questions that our audience, we've been touching on them as we talked, but we've definitely got some questions about fisheries, everybody's favorite topic, and maybe some prospects in NOAA. We saw, obviously, the Obama administration take some action on marine monuments and treat recreation and commercial fishing a bit different there. What are your expectations, George, on kind of a fisheries portfolio for the Biden administration?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. Some conversations some of us are having and some signals we're seeing, just in part based on who the Biden transition team was talking to on fish stuff, and a lot of names familiar to those of us who work in this policy space. So I think, not to oversimplify things, but if you were working on fish stuff with the incoming administration going all the way back to 08, 09, some of those conversations are going to be similar. The major difference is we're dealing with people who now have a much better appreciation for the boating industry comes at this stuff, and the sport fishing industry. And, we spent a lot of time and effort, this industry and the sport fishing industry, in not just assuming, it's going to be a bunch of liberal environmentalists and they're going to do bad stuff on fishing, boating, et cetera. We instead found people who wanted to work with our industries and actually, did some pretty good stuff together. In some cases, held the line in some places where I think we might have had some slippage. To go to an example you mentioned, marine monuments. When it was clear the Obama administration was going to put in some big new marine monuments, we worked really hard to make sure that a distinction was made between commercial extractive activities, whether it was commercial fishing, oil and gas, whatever, and public recreational activities. And we got language into how the New England monument was done, and I think the one out in the Pacific, way more remote and less applicable, that we considered to have been what should be precedent-setting language. If you're going to set aside places like this, you don't have to talk about doing away with all human activity. We can make some distinctions. We're gonna come back to the table with some people, either some of the same people or people who, come from the same kind of world, who have a much better appreciation for these things. And we need to move in quickly on those policy discussions and remind them of where we're really coming from when we talk about protecting our resources and the actual touch that the public has when it comes to sport fishing versus commercial fishing. I would just say on the Hill, Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization is still hanging out there. Some indication on the House side, Jared Huffman in particular, who's a key House Democrat in the House Natural Resource Committee, is going to want to keep the conversation going forward. I'm less optimistic that over in the Senate they're going to want to do something, so we'll look out there. Chances are when it comes to Congress and things having to do with fisheries management, it's going to be kind of some small ball here and there. But clearly, we're going to want to spend a lot of time and effort doing what we've done well in the past, which is talking with people coming to the new administration and reminding them about our economic input, how that needs to be better factored into fisheries management and all those good things. But it's a lot of the dynamics and discussions are going to be very familiar, I think, to those of us who've messed around in that policy space going back to the Obama administration.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And we didn't have the Bureau of Economic Analysis numbers back in 2008, let alone even in 2012. And so the fact that it just changes the whole conversation when you were able to, I think back then we were saying, oh, we're important like commercial and trying to wave our hand and say, us too. Now we're saying, look, we're just as important as the telecommunications industry, and you're not blinking to make sure that you help them. And so when you've got numbers that say you're 2.1% of GDP, it gives you much better footing. Other thing I would add to your point, George, is 30 by 30. I know a lot of folks on the call have been hearing this. This is an international effort to protect 30% of land and 30% of water by 2030. We saw efforts in California this year that were put forward. We actually saw the House introduce a bill on that. It really impacts, obviously, fisheries, but I think it's that same message, right? That fishing for commercial recreation are different. They're inherently different. You don't have to have one to the exclusion of the other. There's an economics behind it. So I would just add that we're going to weave that same message in what's happening at NOAA, in what's being talked upon on the Hill, but also in that 30 by 30 narrative that we can protect our water, but we can also continue to allow sustainable and use of recreational fisheries.
Just one last, sort of finer point here. We, NMMA, along with our partner organizations in this policy space, including American Sport Fishing Association, I won't start naming all the groups, but it was a group effort that got the Modern Fisheries Act passed. And it's the first time in the history of Magnuson-Stevens, which was first enacted back in the early 70s, that manages all of our federal fishery resources, that we got rec fishing specific legislation passed that tries to drag NOAA, the National Marine Fisheries Service, into the present day and recognize the profound differences between recreational fishing and commercial fishing. We've made some incremental progress in implementation of that. It's been slow going so far, but we don't want to take steps backward when we have new people coming into NOAA and NIMS. We want to see if we can keep that actually going forward and do some of the things that bill calls for. And of course, that's going to mean too, working with our friends up on the Hill with oversight. And when we start having things like confirmation hearings, we're going to have opportunities to elevate our stuff. Those are really important opportunities.
Okay. A couple of other questions that have come through. Talking about stimulus, obviously many groups, including ours, we're trying to get 501c6 organizations to be included as part of the PPP program. We know it remains to be seen if stimulus happens. Do you think that's still in the mix?
For my part, working closely with you guys on that, we've kept a really close eye on that part of the negotiations. We passed the CARES Act back in the spring, and these guys haven't been able to get new doses of relief done, and that actually has been hanging out there. And we got in there and made the case for C6s in particular. Other kinds of nonprofit organizations have pointed out how totally arbitrary and unfair it was to say, oh, only C3 organizations are worthy of this. And we've succeeded. There was some fighting about, some of the most, the more controversial nonprofit organizations, and one side not wanting them to get funding and vice versa. But what appears to have remained intact for the last several months in the different iterations of language that have gone into, this unofficial deal that's been struck is to take care of the rest of the nonprofits. So I think we still feel comfortable with that. As I said earlier, right now it's much less about, McConnell's now more comfortable with state and local governments getting more funding. He was hating that a while ago. The Democrats seem to have accepted that they're going to have to do something on businesses and their legal exposure through this, and that's kind of been settled. It's just that total amount of money, but we think C6 is in particular looking to be okay if these guys can ever get a deal done.
Okay. Rebecca, can you pull up the slides? I think we're almost out of time, but I want to thank Tucker, George, thanks for your thoughtful insight. For all the attendees, this is something that we're going to continue the conversation. We're actually going to be hosting working groups. So if you're interested in some of our policy setting on the infrastructure as well as the environmental side, we want your input. We want to make sure that we're taking to the Hill and the administration those issues that matter most to your businesses and to your consumers. We're also going to be conducting a survey. We do this every year just to get a pulse of what matters most to your business. And so please fill that out. It helps to inform our decision making. But one last ask of everybody who's joining today is, as you saw, a lot of the success that we had in 2020 and the ability to bring back our boating champions is to be able to have a strong advocacy team. And a large part of that is through our PAC, it's through our grassroots efforts. And so if you haven't ever had the opportunity, we have a little bit of record keeping to do today before the end of the year. Take out your phones and text the word boat and put in for the number is 345-345. So if you're going to text somebody, their number is 345-345. And in the what you would normally write as a text message, use the word BOAT. This is going to take you to a form, helps us with a lot of our record keeping that really paves the way from the advocacy efforts for the next year to come. I really thank everybody for joining us today. Like I said, if you're interested in getting more involved in helping set the policy making, we encourage you to join. You can contact myself if you would like to join either of those working groups, and please fill out the policy survey. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Thanks, George and Tucker, for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.